Hello everybody, welcome to Word on the Street. I am Shelly, your host, and I am here with a guest.
Hi guys, I'm Josh. I'm from up near the Sacramento area of California, but down here attending Santa Clara. Just finished up English and MIS double major and got really into English involvement on campus. I'm one of the scene writers for the school newspaper, which has been really fun.
Right, exciting. Well, thank you today to take the time to be on our podcast. So we're kind of going into it. The theme of conversation is about identities and storytelling. So we're kind of going on the nuances, hit some points, and just have a really fun conversation today. So I guess like something we're talking about is who gets to write the stories. I think there's a lot of controversies of like when it comes to storytelling or who's writing even media productions of books, films, TV. We can often kind of reflect back on does the identity, like the person, is it important for the identity of the person kind of associate with the same thing, the same role that they're playing, or even like in a production of book, if they're an author who is like white, can they write about blackness or like different, specific things on how identity is even written and portrayed. So I guess like are we kind of limiting ourselves when we think about not letting other people write about other identities? Like, can somebody have enough kind of understanding to even produce work themselves? I don't know. Where's the line? Where's the line between that?
Yeah, and I think that line isn't going to be super definitive ever because I think people are going to have different opinions. And I think the medium is a big one because I know some of the topics later get into this for sure. But with like books, it's very easy to potentially even mask certain identities because you can't see the characters. You can't see things like race or sometimes even gender or gender expression, let's say. And so I feel that heavily dependent on the work. I would say like my initial take, definitely open for further discussion, is I think that maybe not no author, but generally no author should focus on a core aspect of another identity that is not theirs as a central part of the text. So I think maybe it's good for white authors to include black characters or characters of other races, but not try to write about the black experience. I think once you reach like a multi-person writing project, like a movie, let's say, that's where it gets a little more complicated. I know in my Indigenous Lit class, we talked about Killers of the Flower Moon, which is not written by an Indigenous person, but they did, for the movie, consult Indigenous tribes. And I think I'd have to double check this, but I think it's generally considered a pretty accurate text about that dark history. I could be wrong on that. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I don't know. I think there's a certain understanding you can grasp. Well, like on a basis of having to say that, because I feel like people use it as an excuse. Well, I just don't understand it, so I don't necessarily want to I guess it could be used as an excuse to not be inclusive. Personally, I feel like that has been a point of narrative, especially when it comes to, well, like, of course I'm a white author, so I can't include other characters because I don't want to misrepresent, but like there's also your way of like maybe seeking out education or seeking out a certain amount of representation. And I don't know, I guess like there's a kind of a fine line between those things, but at the same time, when you're doing those things, you're hitting the potential of talking for a community, speaking about a community.
Yeah, that's what I would be worried.
Stereotypes for a community, but I also at the same time don't want to like completely negate it just because I'm scared that the potential is no inclusive measures. Yeah,
obviously in an ideal world it would just be there'd be more propping up of diverse authors, and then they can offer the perspective. But that's not always the case, and obviously that would maybe be the thing to socially prioritize, but there are plenty of other systems that make that difficult. So if we work under the assumption, okay, fine, we can work on propping up minority voices, but while the majority voices are cis white men and women, what is, the best way to include diversity from them? And I think I would agree. I think, at the very least, including diverse characters and not stereotyping them. I still kind of stick to maybe, their character just the description doesn't need to delve into like a full racial background and their experience growing up if you really don't know that. Mm-hmm. But I think even just like including descriptions or including characters who are gay, you know, you don't have to write a whole diatribe on the gay experience if you don't know the gay experience. But even if it's just a passive part of their identity, I think, although maybe not as realistic as something can feel in our world that's all encompassing, especially in fantasy, maybe make a fantasy world where it's not crazy to be gay or another skin color, and then you just include characters that are, so people can see themselves, maybe not in the relatability of certain aspects of that because you're not writing to like our real world Earth experience, but even just to see characters who look or have aspects that are like them, I think can be very uplifting. I know one author that I think is interesting to bring up is I read all of Brandon Sanderson's fantasy books, and he's very adamant about, well, none of them are set on anything that's even really remotely like Earth, so he wouldn't really have the need to bring up maybe like queer and race relations the way we would experience them in the real world, because his fantasy world just doesn't experience them that way. And I think that's a very easy way to write yourself into including people that are at least visually diverse from each other without having to be obligated to write a realistic experience for those people that reflects the real world, because it's not the real world. So he's like, okay, yeah, the people of Roshar are what we might consider to generally look like South Asian or something like that, but like they don't have race relations, so I don't need to know the Asian experience to be able to write that. I just make them look like that to have different looking people, and people can see themselves in certain groups. Or he has gay characters, but he doesn't really have homophobia because their world doesn't really care about homophobia. And so you're never going to reach the understanding and nuance of someone who's gone through that in the real world if you're trying to put that in the real world. So I think that's I'm not saying authors have to write fantasy so they can do that, but I think that there are genres that fit that really well, where you can just make some modifications to your characters so people can see aspects of themselves in them.
Yeah, I honestly, I kind of like the idea that different genres have the ability to explore these themes without explicitly exploring the themes. I think especially then it kind of intunes to your own reality and then reflect and maybe even give you questions about how people are treated through our world without actually just having to make it, quote, a race conversation. But like, you know, I guess it depends on the media and like how it's done, because like a lot of people have a problem with like Lord of the Rings and their depiction of
orcs is one.
Yeah.
Yep, because Tolkien made up orcs, which I didn't know for a long time. Like, that's a Tolkien original, sorry. And so I think that I actually haven't read Lord of the Rings, so I don't know the description behind the controversy, but I know Tolkien's a very controversial figure as one of the still talked about, like, as the father of fantasy, quote unquote. But yeah, the orcs were like, it was something about black stereotypes. I know it was that much. And also just like, I believe the goblins as like a historically Jewish stereotype, which is like less his fault and more like existing fantasy's fault to a degree. But the orcs, yes, that was definitely the big one.
So it, runs into issues depending on, who's writing and what. I guess that's not necessarily where we're going for, but I guess there's different ways that even these themes are like underlyingly putting a message and we didn't even realize, and then we're kind of unknowingly influenced by it, or maybe not. I don't know what the hell the movie of the production is because I don't know all the details, but I think especially interesting when it comes to thinking about just like film and how the people are picking up characters and then just like playing them, and like I don't know, a lot of people had some interesting thinking about heated rivalry is like the big thing right now, and then one of the characters, is it Shane, has a like girlfriend in real life, and so it brings into question, like, I don't know his sexuality, I can't say if he's bi or not, like this, some of it's like it's none of our business, but at the same time, like, people find it really important for the person to have the identity same as one, but then it's also like going like, oh, so like a gay character can't, like a gay person can't play a straight character, and then, well, if that's okay, like, where's that line between drawing? But I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
I think it's part of all the different like aspects of identity are definitely very different for film. Like, you're never gonna have, I would hope, a white actor play a black character. Like, that's just not something you can do because it's in our society not a maskable part of your identity. But I think with queer identity specifically, that's where I think I would care more personally about the writer. Like, because actors obviously bring something to their character, but a lot of the quote-unquote gay experience you're going to get is going to be based on what the writers have assigned to the actor. So I would think, like, if there is any gay person suitable for the role, they should probably be the priority. But, like, don't not tell the story because there isn't. Because if the writers can write... Now, I don't know the author behind Heated Rivalry. I know it was a book, and I haven't looked into who wrote it or who was on the writing team for the show. But I think it's a tricky one. I think the big thing is to have authors that can speak on it, because then you can write the actor in a way that they are filling the quote-unquote gay identity because you, the writer, understood it.
Yeah.
But having no one on the team that, like, can speak to that maybe is where it starts to be like, okay, well then now was this your story to tell? Because if Heated Rivalry, which I've only seen a little bit of, but if a big aspect of it is the queerness and like the hiding that from the other hockey players, I think they're hiding it, I'm pretty sure, right? And so, like, do you really know what that's like? Like, does anyone involved know what that's like?
Just, like, having somebody on the team to be able to even, like, validate the experiences they're going through to make an accurate representation. Because, you know, on first value, a woman did write this. You know, like, women can write. But it's not uncommon for women to write erotic novels about two gay men.
Yowie!
Yeah, like, that's not, like... a uncommon thing, but at the same time it's, you know, it's literally a whole genre, like, that women, there's a lot of straight women have been involved in wanting to watching you know, Heated Rivalry, and it's interesting how even all these dynamics go in place. So I don't know, I really like how what you're saying, and I really agree with it, especially keep going back to, like, who else is involved in this production, because of course it's not just one motivator, it's the people who continually work with the piece and have a certain amount of affirmation through the process. So, like you're saying, like, when they're doing, you know, this piece, like, how many people are validating this process? Is there also a person who can, you know, talk about this experience and make sure it's an accurate of what they're saying?
And I think there's an additional controversy layer on the almost audience's side of it. I know the newspaper almost wrote, I don't think we did, they almost wrote an article about, like, lesbian porn has been really popular amongst men for a long time. It is consistently, like, the most popular category, and I know that's been called out fairly as, like, very fetishy towards queerness as a whole. And so the conversation was going to be like, is straight women, like, really liking what's softcore gay porn to an extent? Like, obviously there's a story behind it, it's not just that, but there's a lot of gay sex in Heated Rivalry, and is, like, finding that attractive fetishy in the same way? Is it like a, well, you guys did it first so it's fine thing, or is it problematic? Because knowing a woman wrote it, and a lot of it would depend on her identity, I think, in my eyes. But if we worked under the assumption she was just a straight woman, it's like, okay, so you wrote, like, and the book maybe isn't as raunchy as the show, I have no way to know, but if you wrote a raunchy gay novel for women to consume as, like, an attractive thing, like, when does that become fetishy? Like, when are you fetishizing queerness? Which is its whole other story, or topic, I mean. But I think that is another thing about, like, okay, if you're gay and you wrote this gay fetishy thing, is that more okay or less okay? Or is it even fetishy at all? And I don't know.
Because I was on a little bit of investigation, and I, you know, came up with, like, some video essays talking about that genre specifically. I think it was traditionally, it had a Japanese terminology, that it was just a genre where women digested, basically.
Fujoshi, I think? Is that it?
I don't know, actually. But they like the media, and a lot of the reasons were, one, there could be an erotic experience without the scare of pregnancy.
Interesting.
And so it's, like, different elements that make it less anxious as a woman to experience, but they can experience this romance without having to embody the fact that they're a woman. And so, you know, like, because being a woman in certain situation dynamics, relationships, there comes to be more of a power play and a lot more disposition for, you know, I don't know, like, roles, kind of easier narratives to be more fearful of. So I guess it was just, like, easier, I guess the explanation was it was easier for women to be able to digest this type of genre without having the fear of being a woman involved in it, where, with the social and all of those things, elements that's in play. But then, I don't know, I think you're right when it comes to thinking about fetishizing certain groups and queer people, because of course, like, for so long, especially women and women romances, or has been like within the male gaze.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, are women doing the same thing, or is it like different? I don't know. I guess that's kind of what's going through my head when you were saying that.
Yeah, I don't have a strong take, nor do I, because I'm not the one affected by it. Like, as a not gay man, like, I don't care if women think our two men are hot as a baseline, but like, if a gay man was like, ooh, that makes me feel weird, and I've had conversations recently where now I'm seeing a change in the way, like, and this is all hypothetical, but the way people approach my queerness because of something like heated rivalry, and like, that makes me uncomfortable, then that's where I'd be like, okay, fair, right? Like, I'm not dismissing that at all, because I'm sure that has happened with just how popular the show is. Like, I think to a certain extent, even if it's just jokes, quote unquote, I think there's probably been a bit of a different approach to certain people to certain people. And so as a baseline, like, is thinking to men having sex attractive, is that like evil? No. But when it's like popular TV and then I don't know. I don't have a definitive thought on it, because I think it's a really complicated question of like, when is attraction problematic, almost, if at all, if it's thoughts. Like, does it have to manifest in actions to be problematic?
What I thought was interesting was I saw like a clip of an interview, and they were talking about, he was asking the question of the people of the cast. So was it uncomfortable to have, like, knowing that these scenes and productions are seen by family, friends, or whatever? And he was like, no, it's not. Well, because think of every single show we've watched with straight sex. He made a point that basically the reason why heated rivalry is portrayed as so sexual is because they're queer. And the only reason that we look at it as such a sexual show is literally just that underlying perception of difference. And so when you look at a whole bunch of shows that normally have I guess Euphoria was known to have a lot of, sex scenes, but it wasn't the capital of, oh, it's such a sexual show. It was like, no, it's just because it's straight sex. So like, what sex is portrayed as overly sexual or has a different perception?
It's like taboo almost.
Right?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah, like, the queerness becomes a social taboo that elevates it as something like naughty, quote unquote, that makes it more worthy of discussion in certain people's eyes. But I don't know. I think, like, to loop that back around to the main idea, I guess, I think the audience's appropriateness, how appropriate it is for the audience to enjoy, is somewhat predicated on why the show even exists. Like, I'm curious now, what was the authorial intent in writing the book? I can't answer that for the author. I'd have to look up more. But I think it depends on why she wrote it. Like, is this just meant to be a queer love story that's meant to raise a diverse voice? And if she's not a gay man, which I'm assuming she's probably not a gay man, again, looping back to the original question, now is this even her story to tell, even if it was made with pure intentions?
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I think the whole thing is tricky and nuanced, but I think it's worthy of further discussion. And, like, I would, at the very least, encourage people who maybe watch Heated Rivalry and, like, this was really hot. Maybe just think about, like, why. Like, not that I'm saying that's automatically a bad thing, but, like, what does that imply? Or, like, maybe even how have you viewed, this is putting a lot on people, because I would hope most people have not, but have you viewed, like, even at least male-centric queerness differently with just how popular this show is? I would hope only positively differently, but I do worry that because Heated Rivalry is, like, the modern, like, male gay representation that I can think of, period, like, to have that representation, maybe even unduly, like you're saying, but be seen as so sexual, puts a lot on like male queerness as being like almost hypersexual in a way that might not be a fair representation. And that's where I think it could start to be problematic on the side of how it was written and not the audience.
Yeah.
But I'd have to see the show to form a more concrete opinion, because maybe it is kind of like you're saying, like being seen way more sexually than it actually was written.
Yeah. Well, I've watched it. I haven't finished it or anything, but I've watched it like probably maybe like half of it. And a lot of the scenes, like there's no like full nudity. Maybe it's like a butt shot, but like there isn't like full nudity. And I guess their scenes are like already like fully insinuated. Of course, like there's no explicit, like it's not like you don't see anything visual. But other from that, I was thinking of the aspect of the show and how successful it was just because who and what characters were played, and thinking about who can be found attractive in those settings and who couldn't. I don't know. I was watching a video essay about, like I was saying, about this type of stuff, and one of them was talking about how Shane Hollander and his attractiveness was like only would have been heightened. He's not seen as a full Asian character because he's supposed to be like half white, half Asian, and how that even played into the role that he was about to be able to be seen and perceived by the media as a certain amount of form of attractiveness. Because if it was like through the lenses of, okay, what if he wasn't like, if Rosanov wasn't Russian and he was like a different like ethnicity, like how this would actually play into what the perception of the media could digest it as. I don't know if that like made.
I think so. I think that like they're not both white, but I think it's generally like quote unquote safer ethnicities to maybe is it, correct me if this is not what you're saying, but like contemporarily safer ethnicities to show doing this versus if you had like, I don't know, let's go with like a black guy and an Indian guy. Like I feel like that would elevate the racial component in at least modern America's perception of it to be. I don't know how it would be viewed differently, but it would definitely be viewed differently.
Yeah, I guess like that's kind of what I'm talking about. Is just like, if the people weren't portrayed at a certain role or certain ethnicity in the beginning, like the success of the show would differ, or the controversies would like, be explicitly differently. And the reason it's so digestible for the media in a way that like also portrayed, like I don't know if it was full intentionality. I actually have never read the book, but playing that into conversation about who roles can be played in these situations. And also for me, I guess like knowing the success of the show, it was nice as being part of the queer community, being like, wow, like, you know, we're being showed, like our community members are being showed. And, you know, I was happy in that regard, but then also it was like, it's so safe too. Like a lot of, you know, men and men love is way more digestible in the media than women to women love ever through media. And it's never been portrayed like specifically differently. And there's also like, you know, stereotypical tropes and there's certain things, but I don't know. I felt like it was like, okay, it was success, but like it wasn't as big of a success in the way that we thought we're moving in the direction. I don't know if I'm just being hypocritical, but I don't know. I felt like it was lacking in the way that was like, okay, like, this is not new. Like,
no, I agree with you. I think like even if it's not like this crazy fetish thing and it's actually like pretty safe and pretty tame, that in a way is also still makes it kind of like this should not be the only queer representation that hits this level of popularity at the very least, if nothing else. Like to have something that at least in a big part is focused on like fairly the safest, the most consumable, let's say, mass consumable form of gay sex, outside of, I guess, just two purely white men, is not, like, going to be the most groundbreaking representation for, like, especially intersectional diversity. Like, the intersectional diversity there is one guy's half Asian, and that seems about it. I mean, I guess they're not both American, which is something to an extent, for sure. I think having other countries is always, like, kind of dissuades a certain amount of American exceptionalism in stories. I know my friend, that's actually another point. So I'll segue us, but feel free to bring us back because I think it can fit, is, like, also when is it okay to write from other countries' perspectives? Because I saw a friend, and his criticism of Project Hail Mary, which is a book and movie I really enjoyed, was it's very American exceptionalist. Like, the American guy is the one who saves the day. And that's true. That is what happens. Same with Andy Weir's other book I read, The Martian. But Andy Weir's American. Like, I don't know if I'd want him to try to write, like, this guy's from I don't know, Pakistan or somewhere, like, because he's just not going to know. Like, I don't know if anyone's really going to know more than anything, like a fully different other country on the other side of the world with other racial relations and gender relations and things like that. Like, I wouldn't want him as an American white author to try to write, like, the Pakistani voice on saving the world from outer space, because that's where I think it's just way too removed from anything. And that's putting a lot of assumptions on Andy Weir, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be way too removed from any lived experience he's had. So, like, how is he not going to write the book as an American? Maybe a Canadian. It's pretty similar there.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like it's kind of hard because then it's like within your certain set experiences, which shouldn't also be diminished, is what you can also only produce. Like, at the end of the day, it's like what experiences you have will tailor the information and storytelling that you end up producing. And I don't know, I just, in a sense of thinking about how even in the past, like, I've seen works that we've already portrayed other countries as. And, like, even how we've portrayed, like, Africa in our modern day conversation. Like, it's just, like, so off the charts incorrect.
Yeah.
And already like, just so many assumptions in place because you haven't had the lived experience. Well, and I feel like in that case, that's where the boundary or the line would have to be drawn.
Yeah, I would expand on that only in the sense I would say, I think where you draw the line, I would phrase it as is based on how inescapable that aspect of your identity is. So let's go with, like, queerness as the quote-unquote easiest to mask compared to, like, what country you're born. So, like, because one can be in the closet and things like that. Like, although it is always an aspect of your identity, it is one that perhaps, depending on how you choose to present, is less all-consuming than, like, your race, which is something that you always carry with you visually to other people, or at the top, the country you're born in, which will impact every single thing down the line of your entire life, like your economic status, the culture of your country, things like that. So I would say, like, the inescapability of that part of your being, and the more it permeates every part of your life, it's more inherently difficult to translate that to a different author who hasn't lived through that. Like, if Andy Weir is not Pakistani, being Pakistani, all humans are alike in certain ways, of course, but in a lot of ways is going to be extremely different than being American. And there are countries, like I said, I think writing about the Canadian perspective is probably not that different. But even just, like, other white countries in the UK, like Britain does a ton of things differently by inherently being in a different hemisphere. And so I think, you know, it's not just like a linear line. It's not like, okay, country at the top, sexuality at the bottom. But there is definitely a, like, oscillating line going down of how inescapable is your identity and how much harder does that make that for someone else to understand it.
I think this kind of goes into what we're, you know, going on to our second topic about performativity versus positive impact, and thinking about, like, when it's, I guess you're talking about motives and chasing the trends. And I don't know if you want to actually talk about the example that you were telling me about.
The hashtag own voices? Oh, yes, sure. So I was watching a video essay as well recently, and it was a guy responding to a woman who is claiming that contemporary novels suck because they're just too woke, which he was dissuading that argument, and I would agree with that dissuasion. I think under the extremely vague umbrella term of woke, yes, modern novels are usually on average more woke than 30 years ago, for the better. But the only caveat I would put to the quote-unquote to the better argument is I think, unfortunately, self-publishing has gotten bigger, for sure, which is a good thing. But the big five exist, right? And I'm not super knowledgeable on the big five, but I do know that there's 5 big publishing houses. And because they are large corporations, my, let's say, more pessimistic view is that they don't give a single shit about diversity as a corporate entity. Like, under capitalism, it is not their role to care about diversity, which I would argue, I would have stronger arguments about, but unless it makes them money, right? But what's interesting about writing is the base art product of writing is almost always just one person. Maybe 2 if you're feeling crazy, plus an editor, so let's call it 3. But that means the art begins as something that is meant to be maybe it's meant to make money when you're a big author to an extent, but usually it's written out of love. Like, I think more than most other art forms, books on average are written out of love most often because they start as small things. But unfortunately, because most of the time they have to go through a big publisher, there's, inherent sanitization in what gets popular and published, and especially marketed. Because a big reason your book's going to sell is if they choose to market it. And what publishers choose to market is based on trends and what they think is going to make money, right? So I think any diversity is unfortunately filtered in our system through, like, will this diversity sell enough? Will this diversity sell enough to be worth showing? And if it's not shown on a mass level, then it's diversity that, like, I'm glad the author wrote it, but it doesn't matter to the social perception of that group if no one's reading that book. So it means that, yeah, the acceptable diversity, let's call it, I think, is based on social trends. And I think that's been a big, big thing the last 10 years, when we went from very different oscillating positions of the Overton window. Of 2016 was, the Me Too movement, and that's coming right off of the hashtag own voices, which I'll explain in a second, into Trump winning, and then more of a right-leaning shift for the next 4 years. If we're done with things like Me Too, we're done with the woke and that first wave of that, into COVID, big changes with BLM that I think made it, that's where it gets very performative. I think you see a lot of publishing trends around 2020 and 2021 with a lot of novels that I can't critique the actual content of. I'm trying to think of a couple names. I think one of them is called Educated. I'd have to double check, but it's a lot of books that I feel like, at the very least on the publisher side, not saying this was the author's intent, were propped up because they assuaded white guilt. Because it was like, this is how you be an anti-racist, in a time where it was the most socially acceptable for, like, white people to say, like, I'm with you guys, right? Did that last? Well, 2024 told us no, right? And so I think that's sad, because I think those books probably, I'm very critical of self-help books and that kind of stuff in general, but I think those books probably had something to say about anti-racism. But they were consumed on a large level because, to a certain extent, people were looking to perform, and the publishers were looking to make money. Yeah. And so when it was acceptable, there was the hashtag own voices, which was started by an author I was reading in 2015 who wanted to basically say their novel reflected their own identity. Like, my characters in some capacity will reflect my own identity as my own voice, which totally fair. It's to say, like, on some level, this will be a quote-unquote diverse work. You can look into the author. That starts to tell you kind of maybe the story you're going to get. But then, that was 2015. 2016's Me Too, and when for a little bit, it's like, and gay marriage in 2015, where things are starting to look a little more, at least on the surface level, like progressive, quote unquote. And so, of course, publishers co-opted own voices and started throwing it on everything, because now it's trendy, now it's cool to be diverse. Yeah. But that's so performative and disingenuous. Like, you will never convince me they actually care, or it was out of the kindness of their heart, to the point where the website Diverse Books, who I think were one of the original people to use that, cut ties with that label back in 2021, so a little bit later, because at that point it just became meaningless. Like, the performance usurped the positive impact. So that was a lot of thoughts. But what are yours?
No, I honestly thank you for, like, laying that out. In certain things, like, what is coming up to me is, like, even though that it's become, like, a marketable thing of diversity, we can still see it as a move of, like, progression. Like, at least at least it's marketable. At least it's become marketable. But then at the same time, it's like what would be the steps to actually having genuine change for that? Because at the end of the day, I'm like, yeah, like, these elements, like, I'm just throwing a different point, not all I full agree to this, but, I just think that marketability is kind of what the life we live in. Yeah. And in the way that, that's the only way we'll be able to get production. And then even with that production, let's say now we can read these books that people have been seeking to get for so long, or perspectives they wanted to hear. But I don't know. I guess that's just more of, like, looking at in more of a positive. We negated some of the motives in the first place.
I agree with you. I think, like, I can't just approach it from a super pessimistic perspective, or it's like, okay, so when are we ever going to get diverse voices then? Because you're right, like, all these forms of art, I'm trying to think of any counterexample. I mean, maybe if self-publishing gets way more and more feasible, which the internet has helped with that. But under a capitalist system, like, it has to be socially acceptable for them to want to push it, right?
Yeah.
So, like, the only change is like a change to the system or a more permanent shift in social acceptability further left. Because I think social media plus the Trump era has, with COVID smack dab in the middle, I mean, these have got to be, that might be a very young perspective since we're only Gen Z, but I feel like these have to be some of the most rapid changes in what is socially acceptable within a decade period. Like 2016 to 2020 to now. It just feels like we've gone right, left, right, ping, 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 right?
Yeah.
The Supreme Court was like this and then actually this and then blah, blah, blah. And so I think like it requires less volatility in what's socially acceptable for me to feel like it's something that has staying power and people actually care about. And that just requires people talking, people being the voice that's like, okay, here's not even a debate, but like, here's reasons why things should be more perspective. And like, because I know the criticism from the right is like, oh, well, Hollywood's just showing these black people because they want to make money. And it's like, yes, but that doesn't mean it's bad. Like, it doesn't mean they shouldn't do it or they should only show white people. It's like, yeah, they want to make money. It's big companies. Of course they want to make money. And I'm critical not because I agree with you guys, but because that shouldn't be, like, that just sucks. That's like the only reason that in big arts, maybe not the only reason, but definitely a big part of the reason why the arts are like willing to show.
They're not in their desk being like, you know what, I want to change some lives today.
Today, I think I'm gonna get a little woke. Yeah, no. I do think back to books. That's actually, if we again looping to the first topic, and this is where maybe I'm changing my tune a little bit. Maybe it does require authors, like all authors, to try to incorporate some level of diversity into their works so that now that's just the new norm, regardless of social trends. It's like, yeah, that's asking a lot and that's not super feasible and it starts small, of course. But like if every book features a diverse character, and you can define diverse as however, then it doesn't really matter the trend because something's getting published that has some inclusion, right? Or if every movie starts, but again, the movies are less individual. It works with books because the author can choose that, right?
Yeah, I think it started as a trend, but now has segued into more intentionality. I think because, at least in my generation, like our generation, like growing
Your
up.
generation?
Yeah, it's just
my old age.
I'm so old. I was thinking it was like, when like growing up and we watched these films, and like, I feel like that was like the starting of like diversity and like, not like, just like, the snippets, like when Zendaya showed up in Disney.
True. And Shake It Up.
Yeah, it changed for me. I was like, for me, that felt like the closest representation I've ever gotten, like a person of color on the screen. And so it just like, it like sparked something in my brain. And I was like, yeah, I kind of really like this. And then I think it's like, it becomes more intentional as we get older, and we develop and understand it to a deeper level, like understanding why it's so important in the first place. Because at first, it was marketable. Yeah, you hear these stories, but even within the marketability, that's when it started springing life to people who actually realized why it was important. Like, it's for some people, you know, it's not for everybody, but it gave a chance for understanding for the first time. And at least in my opinion, like certain books, certain things, like Know My Name, when talking about like it was an essay case like that happened and she woke up, it was like in Stanford, like
the Brock Turner and Jane Doe, I think that was it. That was the Stanford one, I want to say. Yeah, and she wrote the essay on the essay on essay. And then I'm pretty sure that was it because we read that in my 3 class. That's
it was like out of a marketable place, but it touched people in a different way, like you know what I mean. It left a lingerance of people knowing and referring, especially at the time. I don't know when the book came out, but I remember even coming up around 2017, 2016, and it's still segued today and put into conversation and thinking about the way that these type of things can happen to people and bringing voice to that. And so, I don't know, I think the performativity was the start, but I think it has now impeded in itself and made it more of a thing versus it's less chasing trends and now has made positive impact for community members. Like, now we see what it's like to be seen in this perspective, and now we want to, like, we don't want to reverse back to it. And so now, because of all the reverse, we saw all the benefits of being represented, being seen as much as the capacity can be, and then realized we could want more. And we could strive for more. But I don't know.
No, I think that's a good point, and I think I'm just approaching it maybe a little too. It's really the last 2 years that have jaded me, you know? Like, it's hard for me. People have... I want to agree with you up to a point.
Yeah.
Because I do think that for a lot of people that were maybe, like, neutral or hadn't thought about it, then that diverse... Or even, like, people of a diverse background that maybe didn't think about how much inclusion would mean to them till they saw inclusion. That's where it's important. But just seeing the social landscape shift so quickly right again over the last 2 years, like, it's very easy for me to remain jaded and be like, well, people just don't care. But... it sounds like, at least from your perspective, like, you are an example of, like, learning. Not that you never didn't care, but, like, that diversity meant something to you. So that means I'm inclined to agree that, like, it is probably a net social positive, as long as it's, like, improving things that last for some people. But I still hate that how easy it is to then take that away when it's no longer, like, cool enough. Because I do think that, like... maybe when people grow up, like our age, with seeing some diversity, then once we're the people in charge, I guess, hopefully, then there's enough people that are like, well, I don't care if it's not socially, like, cool right now. Like, I want to see X, Y, and Z in the media. Yeah. And then that'll be the long-term change. But I guess that's only a time will tell thing. I mean, yeah, I think... regardless, it's definitely positive for the audience, at least temporarily, for sure. That's something I agree with, no matter what. Like, it's better than not doing it ever, right?
Yeah. I know, I kind of think it kind of leads into our third topic was representation as a commodity. Because at a certain line, I feel like when we're talking about, you know, mainstream media picking diversity up, we're just kind of, in a way, commodifying it. And so, like, you know, I'm putting all these ideas, oh, it's benefits, it touches these people, but at the same time, it's also making a certain identity, certain thing. Is it, like, marketable? Is it profitable? It goes into, you know, just thinking about using it for their own gain. I don't know if you've heard of the essay written by Audre Lorde, but it's called Eating the Other.
No.
Recommend. It's really great. It's just basically an article talking about how the commodification of other cultures for basically putting it into the white culture. And okay, let me reverse this. So right now in white culture, or what culture it is, they kind of find it bland or plain, and so they're able to want to take parts of other cultures and use it for their... it's kind of like cultural appropriation. Yeah. But it's more of like, oh, I'm trying this new thing. It's basically using Chinese medicine. Or it's like, oh, I'm doing this, like, look at my new outfit. It's like practicing or, like, being able to explore other cultures within the center of whiteness and being able to not have a lot of... it's more for a personal gain versus, like, it's kind of appropriating other people's cultures that they've been mocked for their lives, or... I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it definitely does. Absolutely.
I can just see it as trending towards a lot of problems. Especially, I don't know, have you seen, like, on TikTok or in the internet, it was like, I'm in a really Chinese part of my life right now.
You met me at a very Chinese time in my life.
Like, that is actually, that's what I'm, what's happening. But.
Yeah, the stupid Fight Club meme. Yeah, I agree. I think the broader question is the whole appropriation versus appreciation. I think, unfortunately, it's usually appropriation. I think it's kind of similar to the last topic, whereas does it ever become a positive? And I'm leaning towards no again, but does that lead to people accepting more aspects of the culture? I think for the way white people currently approach it, no. I think it's like, I'm trying to think of a good example. Like, thinking, oh, voodoo and magic is cool and voodoo dolls, etc. But to actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's based in certain places in Louisiana, right? That's largely Louisiana culture, I think, New Orleans specifically. And, like, something like Princess and the Frog, actually, ironically, despite being Disney, a huge company, actually seemed to care about, like, hopefully accurately representing that. I wouldn't know super well. But, I don't know, it's something where we throw around voodoo hoodoo as, like, a joke or, like, something funny. But, like, to people that's like an actual important aspect of their culture. But I'm sure this is a bad example because I don't know anything else about that culture, but I'm assuming people wouldn't care about other aspects of that culture, which I guess my lack of knowledge tells you that at least mainstream they don't.
Like actually seeking truth in it. I think there was like a clip that the dolls that the needles are found in are just like signifiers for where the last patient asked about where their pain was versus actually being like a
versus being magic pain. And
yeah, because I went on to an event and I helped at this event, and it was basically this author writing about, it was a philosophy author, and they're writing a book and talking about how voodoo magic and magic in general is portrayed on film and how inaccurate or like ways that they portray it. Like every witch film that you've basically maybe watched has portrayed quote voodoo magic incorporated it, and how like these themes like manifest through it. Anyway, it's really interesting, but yeah, you're right. Like it's just they take aspects and ideas of it and then they make it for their own portrayal and ideas, even though it's not even something that's remotely accurate. It's like, oh, here's your representation, which is not,
I'm trying to think of a better example that I'm actually knowledgeable on. Because I think with food, it's fine. If you're buying the food from a restaurant I think it's fine for a white person to be like, I really like Chinese food, and I buy it from Chinese places, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with that. That's, even if it's a food that certain groups maybe, the food is like something that people target as a form of being racist. Like, there are slurs based around the food, right? But even if the only aspect of Indian culture you like is the food, as long as you're not being otherwise hateful, I feel like you're supporting the culture financially if you're buying Indian food from an Indian place. So, I don't know. It's like, okay, well then what's the difference? Because there absolutely is a difference. I just don't know how to quantify it, I guess. I think maybe because you're supporting a business and you're supporting people who actually are giving you permission to engage in the culture via the commerce of selling you the food at a restaurant is like, okay, don't turn around and then be racist, but that is like an okay way to engage in another culture, primarily.
So you're basically talking about like when is appropriate to engage in cultural other activities.
Yeah, and I think food is basically always, especially when you're like, maybe not if you're like, okay, the only exception I can think of is you're like, I made Indian food today and here's my TikTok about it, and like, even then it's probably not like the worst thing in the world, but it's like the most acceptable, I guess, in my eyes when you're going to a restaurant, with actual, let's say, to continue the example, Indian people, and you're buying and eating the Indian food. It's like, okay, well then you're just like engaged. That's with permission, right? Like that's an inherent permission via the restaurant existing. I think when there's not permission from anyone in the group is definitely when it's like, okay, you're probably going to get to a problematic aspect in some way. Like, let's say I'm big on being again, a completely different culture, but pretendians, so like taking aspects of indigenous American culture. If you go and buy hold a tomahawk and you're like, guys, this is like native culture, when there's no one else, like no one gave you permission to do that. Who are we joking, right? Like you're just engaging in a stereotype. So that is like the complete other end that I can think of like, you're just taking something you saw in some piece of popular media. You're not understanding any actual cultural connection. No one gave you permission to do that. You're not doing your due diligence at all. And so then it's like, okay, well, what's the middle ground? Again, what's the line? The overarching question. Okay, so great, where's the line? And I definitely think, like what you said, like the line is on the side of erring on the side of not doing it, especially without permission. I know I had a couple friends who, I'm gonna mess up all the terms, but they got invited to go to a cultural event with that group that involved wearing a specific outfit, but the group was like, no, we want you to engage in our culture and wear this outfit with us. And so he was like, okay, and he did. And I think everyone was happy he did, because to them, from their perspective and the people actually involved, it felt like this is an engaging of our culture where we're teaching you how to do it and we want to teach you how to do it. But to take that initiative on your own is probably where I would say it starts to get problematic. Like, I'm just going to show up in my attire and say I'm part of it now. So permission, I think, is my big line, basis for the line.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's a lot.
No. I can see where the motive is, because like it's like it can be difficult in those spaces to engage without feeling like, am I going to offend somebody? Am I going to hurt somebody? Am I going to do these things? But also at the same time, I think like speaking from just like wanting or like hearing about different perspectives on this, like sometimes the fear can also be be seen as like, oh, you don't want to engage. And so it can also, like, just perspective wise, like, it's like, well, like, don't want to try because you all think all these things, but then at the same time it's like, so I feel like there's a line like, yeah, permission is important, especially depending on like what cultural thing it is, but then also like asking and engaging is also another, I guess, like, giving permission, but also just seeking it out yourself. You're talking to somebody with experience, you're talking to them, how would you feel about this? What is this like
find out the line for yourself.
Yeah, like, right? Figuring out the history, because at the end of the day, people don't mind from other cultures, or some even people can even feel proud about that, people are doing certain elements in their culture, because then they're like, well, I'm feeling seen, I feel incorporated. And especially like being seen in the mainstream media, specific cultural acts in a real represented way it's very uncommon. And so it's like, to be able to see it in a certain way, in a certain respectable way, is important. But I guess there's a certain point where it just feels like commodification, and then it's, and then the examples you're using, just there's no engagement, like real engagement to progress yourself and understand just for your own, benefit.
Yeah, and I think you could even bring that, again, I could not try to rationalize an argument of like, it's not okay to eat other cultures' cuisines, right? But like, am I going to a Mexican place to engage in Mexican culture? No, I just want a burrito and I'm hungry, right? And so I'm not, there's always an aspect of like, that is like the one exception I can think where like it makes sense to commodify the culture. Food is something people share. Food is something everyone needs. Like, I don't think that's problematic. And I guess if someone from a culture chooses to sell like items representative of that culture, that's where I start to get a little like, okay, like the selling of the commerce is being done to the benefit of someone of that culture. Again, I'm trying to think of a good example. Like someone from some culture selling an article of clothing, let's say, that represents their culture, but then a white person buys it and misconstrues it. That's where it's like, okay, like you literally commodified it, right? But again, it was with permission from someone. So I'm almost backpedaling on saying that permission is like the end all be all, because I'm now thinking of exceptions to that, where it's like, well, one person doesn't speak for their entire culture, right?
Yeah, no.
You might, if a black person says, sure, go ahead, say the N-word, I don't care. You're not speaking for all black people, right? Like, no. So, yeah, I guess it's nuanced, but I do agree with your underlying point of like, engagement is how change happens. And like I'll generally agree with the sentiment that one of the biggest positives about America as a country is the melting pot idea. So how do we encourage the melting pot without, one, appropriating cultures, and two, erasing cultures, which I think are two big problems that can happen, but still allow cultures to interact and intermix and create new things that are unique and interesting. Like, is it Cajun identity, I think? In, again, Louisiana, I believe. That's like a melting pot of like the indigenous people that were there, and the Spanish influence that was there, and the French influence that was there, that led to like something new. And hopefully I'm using the correct terms there, but like there is, and that would not have happened if none of the cultures wanted to interact with each other or were scared to interact with each other, right? So I do agree with that underlying point for sure. And I definitely don't have a definitive answer for like, when is it negative commodification outside of like, I think it's the only time where I can definitively say it's not negative is like sharing food from other cultures.
I think sharing food, yes. The only pushback I would have is when I know people in the media are like portraying certain foods, but they're making it sound like this new thing that it was, or even things in general. So like I was talking to my teammate and she was talking about how like now like white people are doing their like edges and they're calling it sticky bangs. Or they're like, they're making a Korean dish and they're like, oh, like spicy soy sauce cucumbers, where it's like it's a dish, it's like a banchan dish, it's like a specific side dish that's created from culture. So it's like that's the only thing where it's like, oh, I'm making this like new thing,
I, white person, invented. Yeah, totally agree.
And then it's like, oh wait, no, that's been part
it's
of the
like
culture,
shout the source. Works cited, please. Where's the bibliography? No, I definitely agree. I was more thinking of like buying and selling food made by someone actually.
Oh yeah, like
but
just like
yes.
a restaurant. Yeah.
But even then, I still think I'd agree. Like unless you're peddling it as your own thing, like trying a recipe from another culture isn't a bad thing either. I think that's one of the most. You're probably not going to do the best job, especially the first few times around. I wouldn't, but I think that's one of the most like safe and like maybe not effective, but definitely safe ways to engage another culture.
Yeah.
It's like try to do what they do, give credit where it's due in that aspect. And maybe you find a new food you like, and then you're willing to show your friends this restaurant you found that also serves it, and now you're interacting with people that work. Like, that's how you can kind of a safe way to encourage the melting pot in a positive way, I think.
Yeah. I know this is like a little bit of a different direction, but our next one we kind of were talking about earlier, but historical accuracy versus modern sensibility, and when it's okay to use certain language or use certain contexts that could be harmful for a community, but then also display the historical accuracy of a film, a book, especially like I don't know, there's so much controversy to Kill a Mockingbird, like as being a banned book, and like holding language that can be really harmful for a community, but I think it's also like difficult because a lot of communities do reclaim the word, but then it becomes no one specific community can use and create that word, like use the word and take back the power in a way.
Yeah. I think this might be the hardest question for me that we've discussed. I'm already not feeling strong about any of my takes. But because I'm looking at the examples you wrote down here, I think I lean towards historical accuracy. Only because I think so many people are not truly knowledgeable on the history of let's just broadly say, things that have happened to minority groups. And I think it's very easy to write that inaccurately, but I think sanitization further makes it inaccurate. I think it requires an extreme amount of tact, for sure, to not just be like, I'm going to throw the N-word in my book because whatever, right? But I think this gets it more broadly, but let's go with like Central and South America. America's done a lot of bad shit to Central and South America. And, you know, to sanitize what actually happened if you were writing a book about like CIA involvement in Fidel Castro attempted execution. Like, I think that's a perspective where like, if you're knowledgeable and you've actually researched the topic, tell it like it is, because people don't know. And so something like To Kill a Mockingbird that's like fiction and probably based on things that actually happened, but isn't necessarily like I guess telling us things we didn't know. Maybe it is, but because I read the book in high school, I just feel like it feels like common knowledge in a way that maybe it's not. So I guess I'd rephrase the whole thing as like, it depends on if you're adding something new to a historical conversation. Because I think if you're adding something new to a historical conversation, that's when it's really accurate not to sanitize. And I'll give you an example. The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, I think a lot of people grew up reading. I never read it. It is now considered a terrible, terrible historical book. The author is critiqued heavily. And a big part is, it's not like he just sanitized language. Okay, they're not going to call the Jewish kids slurs or something. But he went a step further and sanitized the Holocaust as like a thing that happened. And he's like, Hugo's not, I think it's Hugo. Hugo's not Hitler Youth. He just like feels bad. And he doesn't know his dad's a Nazi. And it's like, no. That's not like, I would rather you take the opposite extreme. And this kid is like racist and saying racist things because you are not portraying like the horrible things that happen. And when we live in a world that's like, people deny the damn Holocaust, it's like, I think that's when, I'm not going to take the sperm stance that it's always going to be the good case, the right case, sorry. But I think like maintaining the horribleness, the treachery of historical events that have been enacted by majority groups, including the language that was used, continues to, if nothing else, show us why that language is still harmful. So, and I'm thinking of books in my mind specifically. I think it's a different conversation with movies, which we can get into for a second, when you have to have an actor like
read off script.
That, but in my mind, I'm saying this for books. But I don't know, what's your thought? Because I think this is one that you could very easily tell me the opposite opinion, and I wouldn't say you're wrong.
I guess when it comes to books, I think it's really something that you're kind of talking about when it came to like storytelling, but like the motive of what is trying to be executed and why language is put in there in the first place. And I think To Kill a Mockingbird, scrubbing it is takes away how hard the historical time of it and how unfair it was, and how this type of, it helped you conceptualize it in a deeper way. And at least for me, when I remember learning about To Kill a Mockingbird in class, my teacher read word for word for that book, and they did not hold, a Black identity. But, when she was doing that, she was explaining, like, why she read it aloud and what choices she made about it. And of course, we could talk about maybe was it not the right thing to do? Wasn't it, like, in my opinion, I don't know if that was completely appropriate, but through that process, she was trying to explain that some words just had such depth and meaning and hurtfulness for a community that it was not appropriate to say. And, like, I think when it comes to accuracy, I think especially in time that media has become more scrubbed and that we've had to try to clean up ways that we said things, and words that include diversity and inclusion are under fire and become buzzwords. Like, I don't know, it irks me in a way, because if we're willing to take away some things, how much are we willing to take? Like, it's like an all or nothing, but I guess there's an in between for sure. But I don't know, I for me, it's really about the motive and how well they want to show accuracy. But of course, they shouldn't do it unnecessarily, and they should also be talking to somebody who could be impacted by the community to see how they feel about what they're trying to create and what they're trying to instigate, to get feedback about what they're doing and what harm it actually could potentially cause. Yeah. Because if you're creating these works, there are some things. But then at the same time, I feel like history is so much scrubbed. Who gets to write the story? Who always gets to write the story? The people who usually, quote, are able to colonize, the other. And so, I'm thinking of, like, the rape of Nanking. Yeah. Nobody, historically, there's not a lot of accuracy out there, and there's not a lot of storytelling about there. So, like, having a piece of that is very accurate and, talks about the gruesome things, sometimes it's our best way to be expansive of the way that we know things. But I know it always comes with explanation, because when we were talking about when I was in middle school, the Holocaust, we had somebody who wrote, a figure of, like, Nazi-related things. And so, like, they thought, they didn't digest it and thought it was something, like, they could just, cause a reaction. Yeah. And so it depends, like, I guess that goes into, like, what age is this important to have these conversations. Are we thinking about what an age limit for books, which is also questionable, and then thinking about content that is appropriate for younger audiences. I didn't even think about the age aspect of it. Like, I think ninth grader, well, I read it in ninth grade, I don't know if that's universal. I think ninth graders is appropriate to read something like To Kill a Mockingbird from an age perspective, but are you going to give that to a third grader? Maybe not, right? Yeah. But is that a form of censorship? I guess technically yes. But I do think it's a censorship that you have to have on a certain level. Like, you're not going to show kids every form of media for a reason. I think that can be co-opted. It has been co-opted. We can't teach kids that trans people or gay people exist, blah, 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 right? Which is stupid. But there are things that, like, although I am for showing the brutality of let's call it, like, imperialism as a whole, I don't want to tell a 6-year-old about it. I definitely think it's, because the question as we framed it was, like, under the context of a historical novel. And I'm certainly not in favor of going back and revising existing works to scrub them, because I think that's a very slippery slope of, like, book banning, censorship, things we see from more conservative groups doing for their own gains. I personally wouldn't encourage non-black teachers, or probably even black teachers, to go and say the N-word out loud, but it doesn't mean, like, okay, don't read To Kill a Mockingbird at all. But when we get to, like, contemporarily, it's interesting. Like, okay, a white author wants to write a racist character in the Big 2-6. Do racist people say the N-word? Yeah, obviously. But, like, should that be in a book set now? I think, I still don't know for sure, but it's a lot less important. I think it's a lot less important when it's something we're currently living through. It might be important to people in the future as a reflection of the times. But right now, it's not as important as, like, maintaining, an understanding of Jim Crow era racism compared to, like, understanding racism today, right? So, I don't know. I'm definitely more hesitant
to encourage that, to be like, oh yeah, that's fine. And then there's the added layer of like, if we move past just books, okay. Because a book, the author's writing a word, and obviously words can be harmful, but when it's a movie, you're adding this layer of the scriptwriters have written a word, and now the often white actor or actress is now, let's go with Leonardo DiCaprio and Django Unchained, is now slinging around the N-word. And it's like, okay, it's also meant to be a historical piece. Like, would the movie feel sanitized if he didn't do that? I think to an extent. And then if we go to another Mr. Tarantino with the N-word movie in the end of Pulp Fiction, which is only set when it came out in the 90s, like, he cast himself to just say the N-word like 3 times. And, like, to me, that felt really unnecessary. Because you're not showing a antebellum period historical piece where, like, that is a realistic aspect of the character. You just wrote a character who said the N-word. So to me, that's when it starts to be like, okay, well, why'd you do that? Like, where's the motive? Where is, if your motive for doing it with Django is because this is a anti-slavery story and that is what slavers said, I think I can understand that. I think it's still a muddy waters and not something I'm going to say I am the end-all be-all opinion on, but, like, I understand why you did it. But if you just wrote your character to stand in, I think, a kitchen and say the N-word 3 times to Samuel L. Jackson, it's like, well, why'd you do that? Like, what was the motive? So, I don't know. I think I lean towards it being the most, and maybe still not entirely, the most appropriate when it is a period piece. But when it's contemporary, I guess maybe if it's important for the context of that character's existence and realism. But then when you're doing it just on a character where it doesn't add anything to the character, it's like, why are we doing this?
Yeah.
And when you cast yourself as that character,
literally.
What are we doing?
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, because I recently, I don't know, Euphoria season 3 just came out, and I've been, watching the episode. And one of the white characters uses the N-word toward one of the other characters, and I was like, it didn't have really full like contact, like, it didn't, for me, it didn't feel necessary to incorporate it, but it did give some shock value when I was watching it. I was like, like, whoa, like, why is he coming at him like so hatredful? Like, I don't know, I was a little, and I guess it's really telling, like, when it's like a historical context versus just like a modern film. Yeah. Like, when it's like incorporated to give, I guess, deeper understanding and depth about the circumstances and like, I guess, even rage for the characters, that's what's happening for the story, But yeah, honestly, like, I feel like the elements of having visual and audio versus, reading it off of text, there's a dimension, but then also it's like you are an actor, and so there's a certain element where you carry a certain position socially in life, and I don't know, just like thinking about how this deeps into your world versus your just, I guess, quote, whatever film, your art, whatever production you're doing. But yeah, I
definitely don't think it makes actors like evil or irreconcilable. It's just like, is it something we should be socially accepting? I don't know. When it's for shock value, that's a hard one, because I think the N-word's just the easiest example for us to pull from. But, like, to have a white character in writing, like in a piece of fiction, be willing to say the N-word does add something to their character, because that is something that, like, places you in a certain social position of, like, you are hateful, let's say, is probably the easiest word. You are hateful, or at least, like, laissez-faire about being at least casually racist, probably more than casually racist. So, like, it makes sense from a character writing perspective. Let's go with, well, this is historical, so it's harder, but Stephen King's It, which I brought up, I think, when we were talking about the podcast before actually recording the podcast. Watched a video. You said that book has the N-word 101 times. And it's like, holy shit, you wrote the N-word at least once every 10 pages, right? But it's also a small town in the 50s. And there's one black kid in the whole town. And it's like, yeah, the racist bully gang is absolutely, makes sense to be written, to be characterized as people who are going to sling the N-word. But Stephen King also loves being casually sexist and racist, so I can't give him that much credit. Yeah. But it's like, okay, I think on even a non-social level, Would I care if it changes the context of the story, if it happens or not? Like Pulp Fiction, I don't think this random side character not saying the N-word changes the context of the narrative. So it's like, just write that out, bro. Like, why are we putting this? But when the character is Mike Hanlon. When Mike Hanlon's big thematic thing is his primary fear is the racism he and his family experiences, it almost feels necessary, maybe not to the quantity that King chose to do it, but it would feel like it would hamper the story if that racism was not rooted in something so impactful as both actions and words. So, I don't know. And then, like, they didn't do it in the movie. That's the thing. The 2017, 2019 movies don't have the N-word, so they
able to portray the same story without even...
Yeah, like, they showed that you can. Granted, Mike's kind of underwritten in the movie, but the point still stands. Like, they found a way to not do that and tell a similar story. So that's where I'm like, okay, so now you're showing that, like, it's historical, yes, but and even, I would argue the book's historical at this point, is 40 years old, but is the sheer quantity you did it with, I'll argue, is realistic, but I think you could have achieved the same character nuances without doing that, I think. So I really just would want to hear, I guess, the perspective of the people it affects primarily. With that specifically, I guess, so black people with the N-word, because, like, to me, I'm like, yes, I think this adds to the character, blah, blah, blah. But if someone told me this has substantial social impact on me and my ability to read what I think is otherwise a pretty great novel, then I'd be like, well, then it shouldn't have been included, because I think it's something worth experiencing. And for someone to be uncomfortable with that because of that is totally valid. And, like, how necessary is it to the story?
Yeah, for another, especially the people who are holding the identity and digesting the work.
Yeah.
Like, how does that feel amongst them? And then also thinking about not only other derogatory terms, the R word, the C word, and there's just different languages that, where it, I guess, becomes a question of how much of the context even really matter and why is it being used in slang. And I guess it's like, I don't know. I feel like it's just, you're right, like, how necessary is it for the storyline? Like, what is its intentions to move it forward, to give you the depth?
The motive, like you said. I think that was the operative word. Like, oh my God, stop dropping ring challenge. Yeah, so, I mean, this is one where I really don't have a definitive answer. I think there are contexts where it probably makes sense, and given contexts where I definitely don't think it makes sense, but I also don't think my opinion is the end-all be-all on this. And I think, like you brought up with the R slur, that's a good use of, like, society treats slurs not as all equal, for sure. There are more socially acceptable slurs to say. You can make a million arguments about that in and of itself, but it's like, okay, should we only police the most extreme ones? I don't know, because even, like, Percy Jackson, I was re-listening to the second book, and the bullies called... Have you read Percy Jackson? Or do I? Okay, so I'll give brief context. Percy has, like, this half-brother who's a Cyclops. So he's big and has an eye and he's kind of dopey. Like, that's how he's characterized. So in the second book, the bullies call him the R slur. Which, like, would middle school boys call him that? Yeah, absolutely. They're middle school boys. But they changed that retroactively in further reprints. And I'm like, yeah, it's realistic, but you know what? It is a kid's book. I think, like, not showing that word is socially acceptable in a kid's book, especially when they're not going to understand the nuances, makes sense. And it's like, yeah, it's censorship, but, like, that's a censorship where, like, especially because children are kind of dumb. Like, most adults, I don't think, would, like, read a slur and, like, be like, let's unpack the nuances of the use of this slur. But kids especially aren't going to do that, right? Yeah. So, but, like, I don't think Rick Riordan ever would have written the freaking N-word if there was a black character. So, like, it was, especially in 2006, I think, it was more socially acceptable, and I'm glad it's not. But so those whole things exist on a spectrum and a wavelength as well, which adds another layer to it.
Yeah. Thinking about what word, because, like, I feel like at least in conversation, like, those type of words are not as policed, and maybe if they are, they're not to the extremity. And so thinking about, like, what society deems as the worst, to, like, other ones that would some people think is, like, a little more acceptable, putting in air quotes. But yeah, I think that really brings into conversation about, like, age too, like what we're talking about. So
it's like, if you show a third grader To Kill a Mockingbird, not only are they probably not going to understand the messages. But it's like, are they just going to read the N-word and go, oh my God, it's taboo, so now I will say it. And it's like, well, we definitely don't want to encourage that.
Yeah.
So there's just a lot of layers to it. And unfortunately, I would say my own verdict is, I think it's context dependent, but I don't have the grand take. I wish I could give a definitive answer, especially on this one, but
Yeah.
definitely can't.
Well, we'll segue to our very, very last
Yep.
topic, and it was kind of talking about character descriptions. We were kind of talking about how both the reader biasy and then the author biasy in formulating these type of characters versus like us digesting it. And I thought you actually brought a really good point about how like book characters and like the vagueness gives you a chance to diversify it yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think the complex but generally shitty character that is J.K. Rowling is interesting because I've seen a lot of, not discourse, sentiment online about feeling like Hermione, two people felt black-coded. And I think people have contextualized Harry Potter for themselves by having, I think, both Harry and Hermione as black. And they found like comfort and diversity in that. Now, would I ever assume that's intentional by J.K. Rowling, who wrote the lovely names of Kingsley Shacklebolt and Cho Chang? Absolutely not. I would never give her that much credit. But it's like, okay, even when the book like sucks at those elements and like doesn't have that diversity, like, is there something nice in having people be able to find comfort in it anyway? And I lean towards yes. Don't give credit to it. But it's like, if you're not going to write well-written, or at least not completely shittily written, diverse characters, the next best step is a lack of description. Where, especially easier in a fantasy world, where, like, again, to go back to Harry Potter, it has its own form of racism. So, like, under the context of what she's written, the wizarding world does not have, like, skin color derived racism, presumably. Mm-hmm. So, like, you are able to kind of leave the characters as blank slates, at least racially, without, like, that feeling unrealistic. Because it's not, in the context of this world, it's not an important part of their social identity and experience. And then that lets people place themselves into that. And you can't always do that. You know, if you're going to write a love story, I mean, you can kind of try to have every character be bisexual like Baldur's Gate 3 does, but you know, that's a little harder because now you're having to show aspects of their identity as part of the character arcs and growth they go through. But at least for race, if nothing else, you can choose to leave it vague. And I think it's a decent backup option that I've at least seen anecdotes of it working for people.
Yeah. And I think, you know, of course, there's a risk of vagueness. I think, you know, generally when consuming media, the assumption and baseline is whiteness. Mm-hmm. And so, like, even if you leave it vague, it might just assume to the primary dominant group that you're going to paint that picture for. But at the same time, I liked that you talked about there's an opportunity to look through and be able to evolve the character and the storyline into something that's kind of reclaimed in that diversity. Especially, I was having a conversation with another SIE about the Hunger Game and Katniss Everdeen being native coded in some way, like being an indigenous individual through, you know, I don't know, like how empowering could it be if she actually held that identity throughout this? And it also would both combat erasure from native identities and being part of a group that's already been historically tried to been, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
First did, last did, as my class said. Yeah, and I think especially, if nothing else, for native groups, like that is damn near got to be the most underrepresented group I can think of because people treat them like they're extinct. And so I think that's one where it's like, well, I think if you want to repeat the point you had said to me about like, and you can expand on it as it's your experience, but even as a POC, seeing the default as whiteness, right? And see you even yourself, not seeing yourself as a character, but seeing a white character, because that's so how the media presents it. And I think if any group is going to go through that, I would expect it to be native people who just never see themselves, or kind of like on the earlier topic, just see themselves as like an appropriated group. Like, there's a native headdress in this, and a white person's wearing it, and that's your representation, guys. Have fun.
Yeah.
But, so yeah, I do think that's a really strong counter-argument, and I think it's just up to the individual person. I absolutely default to it is best to just include the diverse characters, but it's certainly, I think, better than actively describing them all as white for whatever that's worth. And I think, I don't know, it's like the safe option if you're not comfortable writing about, if you're like, I'm not knowledgeable on XYZ culture, so I'm not going to put any characters like that in my book. It's like, I think we've agreed that's generally something to dissuade and like, okay, we'll seek out nuanced perspectives and like approach it with what amount of tact you can. But the best backup, I think, is some level of vagueness. It's not preferable, for sure, because I definitely think your point makes sense. It's like, if most people are still seeing them as white, you didn't change much. But if even some people aren't, then I guess, again, it's better than nothing conclusion.
Yeah, because, I don't know, like, especially the media, like, certain books I consume, I feel like even the author's default is going to be white. And so in my, like, reading it myself, the descriptions of these characters and how they're portrayed, it's like that automatic white portrayal. But then even when it's characters like especially if it's writing about a male love interest, it's always like tan skin. But then I'm thinking like not like ethnically different, like ethnicity. I'm thinking, man went to tan in the sun, and that's what I'm like perpetuating it, but it's still in the lens of whiteness. And I don't know, I think it's just because of like honestly I feel like even thinking about when I was growing up, like that was the signifier, the tail detail of the standard of what it was necessary, and still it's hard for me to scrub that out when I consume media. But it really just plays an emphasis is like it wouldn't have to be quote like is this okay or not okay if we just had more people of color being able to produce the work that needs to be done, or like like having more diverse writers in the first place and having people who actually can go in depth and tell these stories without feeling like they need to. But then I guess we're really just talking in the lens if you're white and trying to produce work with different people that like different cultures and different people. Yeah.
I mean, it's like where along the line can you rectify the problem? And the easiest thing is the root, authorially, to just prop up my more diverse voices, of course. But it's like, okay, assuming lack of feasibility, what's the next best step? And then what's the next best step? And like, make changes down the line, I guess. But yeah, I think writers for sure have that bias, and as well as readers, and they default to a lot of word choices that are like either going to conjure probably still whiteness, like tan, or they go with something very hyperbolic, like chocolatey, and it's like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
And it's just like even working on word choices to like when you're trying to write diverse characters in a way that isn't, I don't even want to say stereotypical, let's just go with the more broad problematic, I think is an important thing for a lot of folks to learn when writing. So, and reading. It's also a reading like exercise to a degree of like, I feel like almost there's something I haven't tried it. This is just something I thought of, but of like, okay, does it change anything about the context of this story if the characters are vague, if we imagine them as not white? Does that change your own perception of future novels you read? And obviously that only works for books, at least for racial descriptions, because it's too easy to make assumptions when you're looking at an actor or an actress, right? But it's just about when you don't have that visual element.
Yeah, because then the thing is that one of the points is like, how much does it impact like the character and the storyline, how it would have impacted them in the first place. And so that's why it becomes kind of confusing too, because it's like, how much does their identity actually influence the outcomes of how the storyline would even happened in the first place. And thinking about like, I don't know, we like when we talk about The Little Mermaid, like for example, and like how her being a person of color in this fantastical world wasn't like needed, her race, her representation was important, but it wasn't like the essential moving part of the story. Like it didn't matter if she was a person of color or she wasn't a person of color, like as she navigated through the story, because those are not the problems that the fantasy world had.
Yes.
It's more of like, do you have feet or do you not?
A great controversy.
But then like, for example, we think about Wicked, her being green was the big part, which like played perfectly into the themes of being a person of color.
Yes.
And how this like dimension of how she appeared to the outworld and how she experienced the world became completely different. And so thinking about like the essence of like how changing caste would change the dimension of the story and how what problems would actually arise for them in these circumstances.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, because sometimes when you set a novel completely in the real world, or even especially in a historical period, like I think it would be really hard for an author to write a diverse character in a historical period, because it's just going to be like I was talking about how like country and other forms of identity would change how you experience the world, but also time. Like a period piece is already hard to write to also include like sexuality and gender and race relations at that time. It's like, yeah, you can't look at a novel set in like the 1800s and envision everyone as black and have it be the same story, because it just wouldn't be.
Yeah.
Like you're going to, I think you could try, but you're going to ruin the realism of the story for yourself. And then that sort of becomes the more complicated thing of like, okay, well, should this white author, let's go back to Stephen King's It, because it's the easiest one. Like complete use of the N-word aside, it's like, okay, is it even better that Stephen King included a black character and tried to talk about the black racism?
Yeah.
Because he tried to do it, but it required like a full formatting around Mike Hanlon's blackness to write that character. Like Mike Hanlon could not have been a white person without it completely changing the story. So should people change their, because for some novels it's as simple as just describe them differently, because like we said, fantasy worlds, just describe them differently. Great, now they're diverse and you're done, because you just change the context of the world around them. But if you can't change the context of the world around them, you have to write a much more complicated character past and growth and things like that around their diverse elements. And that's more work. I think it's worth it, but that's where it becomes more complicated to have a cishet white author do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for kind of diving into these topics. I feel like we kind of like unpacked a little bit of these controversies, but like led a lot of questions and still is leading with a lot of questions. But yeah, thank you for your time on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
All right, we'll wrap this up and share love, y'all.